All right, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about archetypal criticism. And before we do that, it's worth noting what an archetype is, because it's a term that a lot of people might think they know or just have never heard before, but there's a very particular technical sense that we use the word archetype. So in order to define an archetype, we need to figure out what a type is, because the term archetype literally means something like ancient type. And a type would be something similar to what you would see in like a metaphor or a simile, where if you have a type of a character, so for instance, an antagonist in a story might be a type of Faust, meaning that they make this bargain with the devil and they're doing things that they know to be wrong and they don't choose to redeem themselves. So that is a type. An archetype goes back even a step further. So, like, before you get to Faust, what might you have? Well, you might have, say, like, a wizard figure who plays with the universe and always winds up causing more harm than good. So that's sort of the difference between an archetype and a type. And that's a gross simplification, but it's worth mentioning as a definition here. Like, an archetype in archetypal criticism is going to be something that's very vague and can have a lot of different possible meanings, but they're rooted from this one general origin. So think of like a pyramid. At the very top, you have an archetype, and then down below that, you have types. And then down below that, again, you might have like stock characters. And then down below that, again, you have all the different individual characters that you could possibly have in stories. And it's not necessarily going to be a smooth pyramid either, but probably if you wanted to like make a meaningful graph of things, you'd have the pyramid just like go out pretty radically as you go down the tree. But that's just what an archetype is. So archetypal criticism is sort of based off of social and historical criticism and combines it with psychoanalysis. Oftentimes from a more literary tradition, the people who brought it into literature, because like Carl Jung started talking about archetypes as part of his psychoanalytic method. But that's just the study of the human mind. It's not yet related back to literature. So a lot of the people who bring psychoanalysis theory into literature in the archetypal sense, in Jung's sense, are more focused on sort of what are the similarities between all these stories and all these myths that are linking them together. Which is why I've got Morpheus over there. It's a relatively early alternative school, so it's post-formalist, but it's not, strictly speaking, like quite ever mainstream. Which isn't to say that it's small by any means, but it's not something that you would see in a lot of the literary established world. Amy Maud Bodkin is one of the first people to really do it. She writes Archetypal Patterns in Poetry in 1934, and that's kind of the same time New Criticism really catches on. New Criticism, of course, had its start slightly earlier, but it wasn't fully coherent as a movement. And so the hero's journey is one product of archetypal criticism. Be careful, archetypal criticism is not one method. The hero's journey is almost like a formalist tool that's drawn from archetypal criticism. And if you look at the formalists, a lot of the formalists come up with sort of their own variant of the hero's journey. So be forewarned. A lot of people who use the hero's journey, they're looking at it from a formalist method, not an archetypal method. I also am not a giant fan of Joseph Campbell, not to diminish his works. He has some really good scholarship. But if you just read Joseph Campbell, you get a very slanted view of things. Joseph Campbell does a lot of comparative mythology. Personally, if you were to choose one book to read on archetypal criticism, I would recommend Clyde Ford's The Hero with an African Face. It is written after Campbell writes his entire work, I believe. Like all the works that Campbell writes. I don't know if Clyde Ford read all of them, but he read at least The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is where he borrows the title for The Hero with an African Face from. And he's also very familiar with other psychoanalytic writing. And personally, I think Ford just has both a more refined approach and he doesn't do cherry picking as much, which I'll talk about more when we get to the pros and cons of archetypal criticism. So there's really two major schools. You have Carl Jung's psychoanalytic school, which we see Campbell come out of. And you have Frye's sort of academic, structural, formalist approach. And both are good. I like them both. Frye doesn't catch on quite as well. He doesn't have a lot of people building on and making derivatives of his work in the same way Carl Jung does. But one thing to note there, Frye is more specifically focused on literary criticism in a way that a lot of the Jungians aren't. A lot of the Jungians are psychoanalysts, or psychologists, or comparative mythology people, or anthropology people, and so they're focused on slightly different things than just pure literary theory. So let's look at Jung first. So Jung's central thesis is what's called the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious can be thought of as sort of the framework that builds into human minds. So you have an individual unconscious and an individual consciousness. And what you're conscious of is what you're intentionally doing, what you're aware of, what you're deliberately doing. It can even be automatic things. Jung's theories on this are quite complex, or incredibly complex. You can read probably dozens of books by Jung, to say nothing of countless papers. Jung was very prolific as a writer. His exact definition of collective unconscious changes over time, and if you're reading in English, I think he did some of his writing in English, but it's mostly in German, so you've also got the translation going into it, though one upside is a lot of Jung's work was very heavily edited and translated by his close confidants, so it's fairly well done. But Jung and the psychoanalytic critics who fall into archetypal criticism, who I'll just refer to as analytic or archetypal critics for a while, argue that stories are basically culturally elaborated representations of the contents of the deepest recess of the human psyche, in this case meaning sort of the mind, the world of the archetypes. And Jung's theory about the archetypes is that they're difficult to understand and they appear in different contexts and different ways. So they're so complicated that you can't really even begin to comprehend them, though you might get sort of a symbolic image of them. So for instance, you have one very common archetypal figure is the Great Mother. But then the Great Mother has all these different aspects. You know, on one hand, it's sort of the life-giving force. On the other hand, it can also be cruel if you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You know, so, and one book that would be, I'd recommend if you really want to get into some of the archetypal symbols, would be The Origins and History of Consciousness by, I believe his first name is Erich Neumann. It is a tremendously rich book, but it is also one that is somewhat difficult to read. Jung's theory is that archetypes are based on primordial images. If you listen to Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning, he takes sort of an evolutionary biological approach to this, where he says, you know, a lot of the symbols come from sort of our need to adapt to our environment, and so those symbols were passed down by sort of a biological process. Jung himself is almost spiritual at times, where he says, well, there's like a spiritual dimension that's going into this and feeding into this, which is one reason why Jung is not as well liked by scholars. Though I think the scholars who write off Jung as being sort of like a mystic don't understand Jung all that well. I think that Jung is open to the idea that it's entirely a worldly phenomena that's going on that we perceive as spiritual. But one other thing here that's important is that the meanings of archetypal symbols as they unfold in stories are contextual. So for instance, if you see a dragon, that can mean really bad news, but it could also mean that you are going to triumph over a problem. So it's contextual, it's all interrelated with who you are. In a story, that's who the characters are. But if you really want to do psychoanalytic criticism, you might also look at how they relate to the author. we'll talk about psychoanalytic criticism later because Jung is not the only psychoanalyst. There's actually a more famous psychoanalyst named Freud that you have probably heard of. Dream interpretation is something that's really big for Jung. Jung and a lot of his followers sort of believe in this idea that you can look at dreams and dreams unfold in a way that are going to reveal something from the collective unconscious. Because of course, when you're dreaming, you don't necessarily have conscious control over your dreams. You just get shown whatever your mind is trying to tell you. So it's sort of like that bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, and the conscious has a hard time even grasping the unconscious. So the unconscious might tap into that collective unconscious as well. I'm sort of butchering the theory there. Again, Jung's work spans volumes and is not easily comprehended or easily explained in just a few sentences. So if you're a Jungian scholar out there, I apologize. I have made a little bit of a hash of it, but that's enough for you to sort of know where archetypal criticism comes from. So for instance, like let's say you have characters out in the desert who are searching for this lost, abandoned tower. Well, those things all have archetypal significance. And if we look here, this is an illustration from a book that Carl Jung wrote called The Red Book or the Liber Nobis, or I believe now it's being published again as the Black Book. And it's a collection of, it's like a mixture of a dream journal and sort of a mystical work. And I don't think Jung intended for it to have any sort of religious or spiritual significance. It's all supposed to be sort of a work of psychoanalysis. But you can see several sort of dream symbols here. There's a serpent with a tongue of fire, or maybe even a tree of life coming from its mouth, even though it appears to be in some sort of inferno underworld. And on the right, you have this ship sailing over the waters that has the behemoth in it, or a Leviathan figure in it. So archetypal symbols can be very complicated, very nuanced. On the other hand, to sort of move away from psychoanalysis, you move into Frye, who also is in agreement with a lot of these theories of archetypes, but doesn't necessarily jump into the psychoanalytical side of things. So there's a little bit, when we talk about archetypal criticism, there's a difference between Frye and Jung, even though Frye would probably, and the Jungians would probably write some stuff that looks fairly similar when they assess a particular text. So Frye is not as heavily based in psychoanalysis and anthropology as Jungians tend to be. He's more focused on literary studies. He presents multiple methods of interpretation, some of which are basically formalist, so I'm going to skip over large parts of that, and structuralist in the sense that they're looking at the structure of the text, not in the, again, capital S structuralist. That's one of the deconstructionist movements that we're going to talk about in a little. But Frye is more concerned with classification, and he does this in a number of ways. Divides things into comedy and tragedy, roughly happy and sad. He actually divides them into 4 seasons, each of which has sort of their own mode. So you could almost use Frye's theories to categorize works. He has theories of modes, and these I like quite a bit, as just shorthand for talking about stories. Mythic being sort of so much crossing into the unreal that it's not tied to reality, and instead it's very much focused on sort of these symbolic events and symbolic characters. Romantic is more larger than life characters. Again, think back to the Romantic movement where Frye gets this term, and it's characters who are, all about emotion and individualism rather than rationality and sort of being part of a society. So romantic fiction in Frye's theory of modes would be more sort of high octane. I think a good example would be Mad Max Fury Road, where it's not quite mythic, though there may be some mythic elements around the borders, but it's certainly larger than life. You might have superheroes as being mythic, and then Mad Max being romantic, And then with high mimetic, you're looking at particularly noteworthy characters who are just a little bit better than average, in the sense that you're picking maybe people who could plausibly exist as your subjects. They have good moral character. They are good at their jobs. They might have some tragedy or setback, but they'll overcome it in the end, typically. Again, what the outcome tends to be that comedy tragedy arc, and the sort of level that the character starts at is high mimetic, or you can have low mimetic, which follows more regular everyday characters. That would be maybe a play like Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. I think that's Arthur Miller. I would hate to be wrong, but I said it, so now it's on record. That I think Arthur Miller wrote Death of a Salesman. Or even, for that matter, something that I know Arthur Miller wrote, The Crucible. Low mimetic, where you have these characters who are, in many ways, just sort of substandard, but they're not necessarily incredibly so. Like, what makes them interesting is not them being slightly below average. There's other stuff going on in their life, but the depiction of sort of an everyman versus the best of us. And then you have ironic modes. And ironic modes sort of focus on characters and settings and events that are deliberately below what you might otherwise see. Now, I personally would qualify ironic by saying that you're looking for someone who basically has their life fail the whole way through, and they fail at the end and all the way through. So, Jude the Obscure is a book that I had to read in high school that I absolutely hated, but it's definitely in this ironic mode if you wanted to classify that way. I also think like Franz Kafka, Metamorphosis, The Trial, I believe it's called, are both ironic in the sense that you have people who are going through sort of a farce, and yet they're somehow being carried away by it. They don't have the strength to get themselves out of it. Theory of symbols is probably most traditionally related to archetypal criticism. You have a motif or a sign, which could be something that's literal in the story. So like a motif would be a character who keeps showing up in association with certain events. Or a sign could be like foreshadowing or indication of an event. You have an image, which is that event plus, or something that's actually there, but it also has a deeper meaning. An archetype, which is not quite the same thing as an archetype in Jungian theory. It's more like that's the thing from which other patterns would be made. So when I say a character might be a type of Faust, and you move up to get like a magician archetype, that would be a very sort of Frye style method to look at it. And then a monad is more similar to either the collective unconscious or like even the archetype in the Jungian theory, where it's something where you've brought a lot of stuff together. It's like the purest possible essence, and it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to classify out and communicate. He has his theory of myth and his theory of genre, but those move over to a formalist method or a structuralist method. Sorry about that. And I'm not really going to talk about them because they're not, in my opinion, terribly well built out from what you could get in like a strictly formalist approach. Frye is not terribly influential, I don't think. I certainly haven't seen work based on Frye's terribly often, though I have suggested it to other people. I use it mostly actually for game design, using the theory of modes to sort of say, hey, like when you're thinking about the sort of stories you're going to tell with your game, how are you doing that? And how are you linking these things together? So it's very practical, but it's not very widespread. It's not terribly well used, in my opinion. There's this formalist, structuralist element to it that makes it not strictly archetypal. And postmodernism comes along roughly about the same time Frye is writing and becomes much more popular. So let's look at some strengths and weaknesses of archetypal criticism. Archetypal criticism is much more broadly applicable than formalism. If you remember formalism from my previous video, one of the weaknesses of formalism is that because it looks at forms and styles and conventions and genres very closely, you can't jump from one to another without knowing quite a bit about it. Like if you're going to analyze a poem in a formalist method, you can't jump to an entirely different sort of poem. Like you can't go from a sonnet to free verse. You know, um, I mean, there's some generalizable elements there. Like you could look at rhythm, you could look at if there's rhyming going on in free verse or whatever. But archetypal criticism doesn't have that issue. It looks more at like images, and because of that, it focuses on the human and psychological part of storytelling. And that's true also for Frye's method. Frye's method breaks with the formalists in the sense that you're looking at signs and symbols and archetypes and motifs and stuff like that. So that side of it is much more broadly applicable than the strictly formalist methods, which isn't to say that formalists can't adopt similar things. It's very easy to value stories by meaningful content in an archetypal system, by which we say, well, we would expect a story that delivers on these nuanced and rich interpretations of archetypes to have meaning, to be desirable for an audience. So, for instance, if you have a Hollywood movie that's 2 hours long and has 200 scenes, well, that means that you're jumping through scenes too quickly to probably build up an image and be deeply and richly satisfying. If you have a more in-depth exploration of some of the archetype, for instance, in Star Wars, The Last Jedi, I did not really care for. It didn't feel like it ever went anywhere. Like it was a story about basically a road trip in space, and you ran out of gas with bad guys chasing you. It's like almost like it's almost like an anxiety dream rather than a story. But then you had, oh gosh, I forget what the ninth movie was even called, Rise of Skywalker. I felt like Rise of Skywalker was a lot better, even though there were all these dubious storytelling elements, and they didn't at all answer any of the questions that were asked during the trilogy. Well, okay, they answered some of them, but not very many of them. But I felt like it was more satisfying as a story, because you have, like, at one point, Rey has this encounter with a snake in the underworld, and it's like, that's a very powerful archetypal symbol. It's learning this, she heals it, which symbolizes sort of learning to come to grips with the evil of the world. And so like from an archetypal perspective, that's very satisfying, and I felt like that whole film had all sorts of good symbolic associations that would be satisfying for viewers and audiences, even though there were also missteps. But everyone makes missteps in telling stories. It's about what you do right more so than what you do wrong. On the other hand, you have formalist and psychoanalytic divides in archetypal criticism, where you have people like Frye, you have people like Joseph Campbell on these two different sides of, do we want to sort of try and define and look at archetypes very deeply, or are we entirely sort of building them at every case? Jung would argue that you have to look at each symbol individually as it comes up. And what you're doing is you're more trying to identify symbols rather than referencing a catalog. It's like you'd never say, okay, the snake always means this. When I see a snake, it means this. What you'd say is, okay, snakes are one of those things that often appear as a symbol. When you see a snake, you have to stop and ask, is this symbolic, or is this just a functional part of a story? Cherry picking is another issue with a lot of the archetypal scholarship. That's one criticism that gets leveled against Joseph Campbell quite a bit, and I generally actually agree with it. That's one of the reasons I don't like Joseph Campbell all that much. In his Hero with 1,000 Faces, he goes on for like 300 pages, and he has like, I think 7 or 8 stories that he uses to build his case for what he calls the monomyth, which turns into the hero's journey after some sort of formalist touches are applied. But the whole thing is he's picked these different stories and gives you like one little section from each to build his point. Now, you can argue that, well, if you actually really did more digging, it totally holds up in practice, which is generally true. But you point to the fact that by the time you get to the parts of the monomyth that hold up, you're basically left with just a slightly fancied up version of the, sort of rising action, falling action resolution system that's mentioned in Aristotle's Poetics. So there is some criticism to be made of a lot of the psychoanalytic archetypal critics, that they're cherry picking. They're finding every example that proves their points and ignoring a lot of data that would sort of shoot them down. Another thing about archetypal criticism is that it's hard to value stories objectively. I as an individual can look at stories and kind of analyze them how I want to analyze them using archetypal criticism and find what's meaningful to me. But it's difficult for me to look at a story and really say, okay, this is a great story, it's going to be a masterpiece forever, other than just going with my gut instincts. So it's not, going to say, yes, I guarantee this is a masterpiece. And part of the reason for that is that it's non-dogmatic. So on one hand, you're free to apply it to basically anything, anywhere, anyhow you want. On the other hand, there are limitations to that. There's a reason why a lot of other styles don't do that. All right, that's where we're going to wrap up. Starting tomorrow, we're going to go through a lot of styles very quickly. So we'll probably get through 3 or 4 per video, and then I'll have a strengths and weaknesses that sort of compares the different styles. All right, I will catch you all tomorrow.